For longtime fans of Final Fantasy VII, Rebirth may be an amazing installment in the series that manages to meaningfully build on the original in a number of ways. Visuals are superb, the soundtrack is beyond excellent, and combat can be fun and fast-paced, but it feels like for every 2 steps the devs have taken forward, they've taken 1 step back. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is plagued by pacing issues, and some of the most iconic scenes in the entire franchise are completely marred by bizarre development decisions. Spoilers ahead. The one that may stand out the most to me is the flashback to Nibelheim. When Sephiroth burns the village, Cloud gets injured by some falling debris and he has to shamble his way around town in order to advance. The devs used this time to show the plight of the villagers, but what should have been one of the most heartfelt moments in the game just ended up becoming frustrating at how slowly we're forced to move around the village. It doesn't help that we're forced to a literal crawl at one point, only for a small firing squad of villagers to surround Sephiroth and slowly get picked off over a period of 2 minutes while we can't meaningfully control our character. I get that this can be a device that's used to build tension, but I think the scene is already tense enough to warrant these arbitrary slowdowns. And this kind of builds into level design as well. Generally speaking, I thought the levels were fantastic and it was really fun to explore, though there's a huge caveat that comes along with that I'll get into later. However, one recurring trend I found throughout the levels is that they were all pretty linear, and quite often the only puzzle that needed to be solved revolved around pushing or pulling a big heavy block extremely slowly. There's nothing inherently wrong with this, but the more it's used, the more tedious it becomes, and while I didn't mind them as much when you needed to move the blocks to jump on top of them to reach another area, going back through the game in New Game Plus really makes some of these puzzles feel rather arbitrary and that they just slow down the game. To make a terrible pun, it really sucks having to vacuum Mako energy out of an area before you can proceed. With that being said, the linear level design wasn't bad necessarily, and I still enjoyed myself when I needed to switch between characters like Yuffie and grapple around like a ninja, or climb walls as Red 13. I often found myself in awe at how much the levels sprawled out yet still felt natural to the world they're in, and the music for each area often heightened my nostalgia to sublime levels. If I were to be truly honest here, I did not enjoy Final Fantasy VII Remake, the first installment, very much at all, partially because the combat didn't feel all that fluid with the way the ATP charges filled, and because Midgar is probably my least favorite part of the original game, and I couldn't appreciate how much filler they added to try and flesh the game out. To my surprise, I found myself enjoying combat in Rebirth a lot more, and I really wondered why at first until I figured it out. It's not that I disliked the combat of the original exactly, I just didn't enjoy using some characters like Tifa, Barret, and Aerith. I enjoyed Intergrade's combat more, but that's because Yuffie legitimately felt OP, and I was worried she was going to feel more lackluster without Sonon in Rebirth. Boy was I wrong. If anything, they made her even stronger, so being able to play through the majority of Rebirth with 2 of my favorite characters made combat a lot more bearable and exciting for me, but I can imagine other people's experiences can vary wildly on that front depending on what party members they want to use. This time around, I got a better handle on Tifa's movement, and what I thought was her biggest weakness in lacking a gap closer turned out to not be an issue because she does have one. You just need to dodge before inputting attack to get her to fly toward the enemy. And while this is obviously a skill issue to some degree, there are a lot of these little intricacies to the characters that aren't explained very well for players to pick up on, so it wouldn't surprise me if people ended up disliking certain characters just because they didn't understand how to use them effectively. I know in Intergrade, Yuffie was able to do the box break minigame, and that was honestly the best training tool for me to understand how to throw and retrieve her shuriken, and while it does exist to a lesser extent in Rebirth, it might have been a good idea to have included something like that for most characters in this installment, especially since at the time of this review, less than 4% of players have gotten the trophy for dealing 300% more damage to staggered enemies. I think the other really big difference in combat in Rebirth, which helped elevate it another level, was by incorporating parries directly into combat. I know Remake had the parry materia and Cloud still kind of had a counterattack incorporated into his Punisher mode, but it ended up feeling a bit more organic in Rebirth, maybe partially due to the precision defense materia and needing to parry certain enemy attacks more holistically like Odin or Gilgamesh's. Nevertheless, the few times the game did force me to switch party members, I did feel some extra tension with the combat system, so it would have been nicer if some of the weaker party members were buffed to compensate for their weaknesses. I know certain characters like Aerith can be absolutely broken in the endgame, but it still kinda sucks needing to play through the majority of a game for a character to get good. The last few things I'll say about combat are that I think it still has some of the major issues of the original remake, and that I think it's absolutely ridiculous that the ATB gouge charges differently depending on whether the user is actively controlling a character. If you want to fill up all of your character's bars efficiently, you'll need to constantly cycle between them, which can be awkward and downright disorienting if they're targeting different enemies. Fortunately, most combat isn't hectic enough to require these kind of inputs, but certain characters like Aerith often don't feel impactful enough to use just because of how much more effort is required to fill their ATB bars. I also found myself very rarely using magic materia because weapon abilities are just as effective, and the remakes passively push players away from using magic as much as possible because it doesn't recover naturally in hard mode, and this mentality stuck with me through playing this game too. I'd really like to use magic more, but it's just often not worth the ATB charge, and that's kind of disappointing. And although this isn't that big a deal, I was really sad there wasn't an added effect materia to passively deal status ailments to enemies with weapon attacks. Anyway, my party often consisted of having Cloud, Tifa, and Yuffie for a very simple reason. Tifa is one of the few characters who can reliably increase the bonus damage inflicted on an enemy while they're staggered, and Yuffie is a ninja god at being able to crowd control enemies and deal with any situation that's thrown at her. While Cait Sith can also increase the stagger bar, his abilities can't be front-loaded into Omni Strike or Rise and Fall, so Tifa is generally a more reliable choice for that specifically. I really wanted to use Red 13 more, but his basic attacks were a little underwhelming, and his Vengeance Gouge ability kind of feels antithetical to the fast-paced nature of combat, where the goal is typically to keep attacking the enemy while you evade their attacks, and his ATB abilities were the most underwhelming of them all, though I might not have been using him properly. It's extremely disappointing we couldn't play as Cid or Vincent in this game, especially when the devs went out of the way to make Zack and Sephiroth semi-playable characters, and although it's upsetting we didn't get to go to Rocket Town or the Bone Village, it's understandable given the size and scope of the rest of the game. And this is where I think it's going to be the most hit or miss for people. Although the world of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is very large and can be fun to explore, I think the devs have committed a cardinal sin by commodifying exploration to the point it ends up feeling like a mandatory portion of a Ubisoft game. Anytime you go into a new area, you have the opportunity to collect intel from Remnawave towers that will place points of interest on your map to travel to. This ends up transforming what could actually be exploring a new area into a game of follow the HUD and itemized checklists that just ends up sucking out all the life of what could have been one of the most enjoyable activities in the game. To make matters worse, anytime you do explore an area and complete some of its side activities, stupid-ass Chadley or his even worse alter ego Mai will appear on screen to deliver some expository dialogue over what you've seen or done. It's very tell, don't show, and I unironically think the game would be better if Chadley wasn't included at all. I felt that way about him in the remake as well, but man, Chadley really takes breaking immersion to a whole new level in Rebirth by constantly spying on what the party is doing and interrupting conversations with his calls. Now, I typically enjoy exploring as much as I can in any given area before I proceed in any game to the point it's slightly problematic, but even I became fatigued by the amount required in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Quite often, I found my relief at completing an area being overshadowed with the feeling of, now what, when entering a new one, and part of this is because exploring each area is tied to certain rewards like attaining new enemy skill abilities. Enemy skill has always been my favorite materia, and it has some of the most broken effects, so I naturally want to go out of my way to see what they included in this game. But as I mentioned briefly before at the beginning of the review, this leads to a lot of pacing issues. If you're trying to explore by the numbers, you'll end up backtracking quite a bit, and the time spent actually traveling or being talked at by Chadley ends up detracting from the main story of the game to the point that I think it'll end up burning some players out. even though it was kind of annoying, I enjoyed the challenge of catching chocobos in the wild in the original Final Fantasy VII, but my annoyance only lasted for a few seconds at a time. While I can respect the attempt to make catching chocobos a bit more realistic in Rebirth, by the time I'd finished catching a chocobo in Junon, I was already fed up with the mechanic and hated having to repeat the process later on. I know there's going to be people who say, well, just don't do the side content if you don't enjoy it, and I completely agree with them to an extent. However, one issue that's a bit more unique to the way Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has incorporated the side content is that completing certain missions and quests also affects your relationships with the characters in your party, so you're heavily incentivized to do these missions to deepen your relationship with these characters. While the end result is somewhat negligible, it nonetheless incentivizes players to spend as much time completing these side quests as possible, which contributes to the pacing issues in the game, which in the grand scheme of things is really funny to me that I can complain there's too much side content in a game I enjoy. The time I enjoyed myself the most playing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was when I ignored all the stupid quest trackers and just allowed myself to explore. I genuinely think the Nibel region is one of the best areas in the game, and suddenly being influenced to go to different directions and pick up chocobo tufts was really enjoyable when it didn't come with the pressure of knowing there's another item on a checklist. But by this point in the game, I think too many people are going to be burned out from the awkward pacing of events to truly enjoy it. And this is something I kind of want to explore in another video. There have been certain changes and additions to the story of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth that I enjoy, and others that I don't, and I'm not really sure why. I know the original was pretty lighthearted and definitely quirky at times, but I can't quite put my finger on why I dislike some of these changes. For instance, meeting Yuffie before Junon makes sense as a narrative beat, and would also make sense for her to want to assassinate Rufus Shinra, but I didn't enjoy the execution of it as much as I thought I would. Pun intended, I guess. And it just felt a bit out of character to me the way Rufus initially wanted to make a deal with Cloud and the other members of Avalanche. This isn't to say all the changes are bad. I quite like a few of them actually, like going to the village of the Gi and learning more about the black materia. And while I initially disliked fighting Palmer and Corel, in hindsight, I think it works and helps make more sense of dying sudden attacks on the gold saucer better in Rebirth than it does the original. However, I'm more apprehensive about other changes. Tifa being swallowed by weapon and entering the lifestream is one of these, not because it's different from the original. I like the regression of Cloud's fighting style changing into that of Sephiroth's right beforehand, but because I'm afraid it steps on the toes of the significance of Cloud and Tifa's plight and Midgar of the original game. Other changes feel a bit too contrived for me to be fully on board with them, and two examples which stand out to me are the arbitrary swimsuit requirement to access the beach in Costa del Sol, and pretty much everything else that has to do with the character Roche. While I like the idea of there being a Shinra-affiliated soldier that can act like a rival to Cloud, I think Roche comes off a little too flat and eccentric to be really relatable, and this is a problem that extends from the original remake. While the final fight sequence with Roche is pretty cool, it kinda gets completely undone for me by the way he gets turned into a black-robed man. It always irks me a bit when unaffiliated characters are given uniforms, and while I can forgive the change of chasing the singular black-robed man into chasing black-robed men plural, it kinda just feels really off that they all have the exact same design on the robes, rather than looking like a mishmash of hoodlums. It'd be one thing if it was a weird byproduct of Genova Cell transformation, but even that headcanon conciliation was thrown out the window with the way the black-robed men changed him. With that being said, while I wasn't a fan of the dance scenes in the remake, I had to begrudgingly admit the way they reincorporated it into the drill sequence of Rufus's welcoming ceremony in Junon was pretty smart. While it was a bit goofy for Cloud to be promoted to captain and to be entrusted with leading a drill team, it wasn't completely off base from the original, and I really appreciated and enjoyed the way they captured the headache that comes along with trying to wrangle and manage your subordinates during R&R in a deployment. There was just also an incredible amount of detail that they paid during that entire drill sequence, which I think is really easy to overlook. And that's one of the craziest things to me about these games. The absolute amount of effort they poured into crafting every little detail can't be understated. The amount of bystander dialogue is ridiculous, and the average player may only experience maybe only a fifth of what the game has to offer. I think this is a good and a bad thing though, because while it is more realistic to listen passively to what people are saying, It can also lead to some really awkward moments where NPCs talk over each other, or the audio you're trying to focus on gets shifted towards something else, and there's no way to speed up the passive dialogue, so it kind of ends up becoming a little cumbersome trying to listen to every line in the game. This makes me wish there was a setting in the game where you could talk to NPCs and advance their dialogue manually, but it would come at the cost of some immersion. C'est la vie. Attention to detail extends to both character design and music. Although this was in the remake as well as Intergrade, one of my favorite bits of character design is how Scarlet, the head of weapons development for Shinra, flaunts her wealth by wearing materia in her earrings and necklace, or how each character's materia gets reflected on their weapons in the field. I really can't speak highly enough of Rebirth's soundtrack. It's unironically one of the best I've ever heard, and I constantly found myself in awe at the different variations and themes used throughout the game depending on the circumstance. The date during the Gold Saucer, for example, will have its music changed to reflect the character you're on a date with, and it's obvious the lengths the team went through trying to stay true to the original while enhancing the experience. This detail is so minor I don't think most people would notice, but one thing which blew me away was during the return to Nibelheim, Cloud has a scene with Aerith on the water tower, and while her theme plays during their conversation, it fades into silence as it draws to a close. It remains silent until Cloud goes back down the water tower and his feet touch the ground again, giving the player a real sense of coming back down to reality after a temporary escape. And it's these kind of moments that remind me. Although the devs might not always hit the mark, an incredible amount of care went into the details of crafting each experience the player has. I really enjoyed a lot of the side banter the characters had with each other, and it was really amusing to see how well certain characters played off of each other, like the way Red 13 doesn't growl when Yuffie pets him, or the way Barrett says Red 13 doesn't need to hold back or at least pretend to not hate him when they're forced to go into the Cave of the Gi together. I do, however, wish a little more attention was given to Barrett, Tifa, and Aerith's reactions, since they feel a bit flat, and even though I'm a Yuffie fan, even I think she may have stolen the limelight a bit too much, but that's also just part of her character to a degree. Nonetheless, while Tifa might not have the most dialogue between missions, I did appreciate the effort they put into making her relationship with Cloud feel more strained in this installment, and I'm looking really forward to the resolution of their story arc in the next one. I don't want to talk about the ending too much because of spoilers, and so while on one hand I do think it feels a bit rushed heading into the Temple of the Ancients, and that the temple does drag on a bit too long, I think the events which unfolded at the end of the temple can make a lot of sense with a certain perspective in mind. With that being said, I wouldn't blame anyone for preferring the events of the original, and while I do think quite a bit is lost with some of these changes, I also think the current state of events helps set the stage of what's to come at the beginning of the next installment as the party makes their way to the North Crater. I am both incredibly excited and incredibly sad looking forward to the next installment of the game because it's so far away, but honestly, I think this version of Final Fantasy VII does the original justice even if it misses the mark at times, and while I think it could use some adjustments, the overall feeling of the base game is pretty good. It would do wonders if Square Enix learned from their mistakes and actually let go of players' hands so they could explore more freely in the next title, but we'll have to wait and see. Right now, I get the vibe that Square wants to make sure they get their money's worth out of development, and they're trying to force people to enjoy the various bits of content they've created for the game, but it just ends up being a bit too stifling for their own good. Many of the mini-games, like Queen's Blood for example, are kind of mid, yet have a way bigger role in the game than normal side content, so I feel bad for the people it's forced on who don't want to play it when it does show up. It's also a bit awkward that you can't rebind the controls for some minigames like Chocobo Racing and G-Bike, and while I think Chocobo Racing is neat, I felt like they missed the mark for me because Chocobo Racing was always more about raising the perfect bird and leveling up its stats than the actual race. So with the current iteration of Chocobo Racing focusing solely on the racing, it ends up feeling like a Mario Kart knockoff with worse controls. It's not bad, don't get me wrong, but it's also got nothing on Mario Kart, so it's like why play Chocobo Racing when you could play Mario Kart instead? If they continue to refine these systems, that's great, but too many feel more functional than fun to me, and if given the choice, I'll end up skipping almost all of them in subsequent playthroughs of the game. Ironically enough, I think the best minigame is the piano minigame, and my only complaint about it so far is that I wish they had more songs for us to play. Beyond that, I was thinking they could potentially expand on the formula by having more difficulty options for each song, or incorporating the shoulder buttons for differing octaves. The way that I rate games is on a bell curve, with 5 being an average, fun, and enjoyable game. 6 and above are games that progressively stand a cut above the rest, with a 10 being nearly unattainable for a game that's perfect and couldn't be improved in any way. 4s and below are for games that are increasingly flawed or predatory toward the player. With this in mind, I would give the original Final Fantasy VII Remake a 4 out of 10, Intergrade a 6 out of 10, and Rebirth an 8 out of 10. While the basic combat mechanics for Rebirth aren't drastically different from Remake or Intergrade, having more access to characters I enjoy and being in a different setting than Midgar, where we're given more of the backstory of the game, really helps pull it in a more positive direction for me personally. While I do think Rebirth has some issues with its pacing and handholding the player, actually exploring the world can be quite fun, and I was pleasantly surprised at how fluid it was traversing the map, especially between different elevations. As it stands now, I think a lot of these issues with Rebirth are relatively minor, and if someone was ambitious enough, I'm sure the game could be fairly easily modded into a better state when it reaches PC. After I beat Rebirth, I immediately wanted to go back and play through again without feeling compelled to do it for completion's sake, and unlike Final Fantasy XVI, there's a lot more replayability due to being able to swap party compositions and the flexible nature of materia. I'm really looking forward to the next installment of the game, and with Rebirth already being as large as it is, easily over 100 hours to complete the base game and the side content, I'm really curious just how huge the next one's going to be. I know I'm a longtime fanboy of the series, and I probably have a better understanding and appreciation for what's going on in the story than most, so I'm really curious how others who've never played the original or the remake felt about Rebirth. It's a bit of a shame certain story arcs couldn't be concluded in this installment, but it's all the more to look forward to in the next one. So let me know. Have I fanboyed over Rebirth too much? Is my score too high? Is it just right? Or is it too low? Let me know what you think and why in the comment section. And if you want to discuss more Final Fantasy VII or other games, feel free to join my Discord server. The link is in the video description. Until next time, thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and special thanks to all my patrons and channel members for all your continued support helping keep the channel alive. I appreciate it. Last Protagonist out.